Hello, my name is Lynn Wells from StarTides. And before this panel on Puerto Rico begins, I would like to just lay out a few of the initiatives that are underway that I think really reinforce the importance of what the group is going to be talking about. Beginning with something called the Puerto Rico Prosperity Initiative, which is designed for resilient and sustainable prosperity for Puerto Rico. Just a moment. Slides up there, please.
Yes.
Okay, so Puerto Rico Prosperity Initiative, Sustainable and Resilient Prosperity for the Archipelago. And the point here is, how do we develop a resilient, green, and digitized approach? What's important now is that Puerto Rico is actually the subject, if you will, the beneficiary potentially of 5 aligned initiatives, which represent unprecedented level of domestic support and international interest. The first is the fact that the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, Don Graves, has actually been designated as the Puerto Rico Economic Growth Coordinator. So there's a single focus within the administration. The second is the Department of Energy Secretary, Granholm, has been put in charge of revamping the Puerto Rico energy grid and the transition to renewables. The third is the federal government has issued a plan for equitable long-term recovery and resilience, which is basically 35 different agencies that have gotten together to look at ways to get beyond COVID, mental health issues, restoration of education issues, medical care issues, and so on and so forth. Anyway, this plan, again, 35 agencies, will begin in Puerto Rico. The next is at the New York Federal Reserve, which includes Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, has a community resilience initiative to mobilize private finance for capacity building, and they will begin this in Puerto Rico. And finally, the International Telecommunications Union, which has been working for several years in the Global South to develop a digital cross-sector regulatory sandbox. In other words, places where you can experiment with not changing the rules, but interpreting the rules leniently to get to yes more easily, will make the first G7 initiative in Puerto Rico. So the combination of these 5 represents a large and really unprecedented level of high-level policy support. And more importantly, or equally importantly, this is the precursor to a large amount of resources that are likely to be available in the next few years. If you put together the combination of remaining recovery funds from Maria and Irma, the Bilateral Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, some of the American Rescue Fund, there's upwards of $100 billion that's expected to flow to Puerto Rico in the next few years. And so the question is how to use this best for the people of the archipelago, not just for the contractors who bid on the projects. The elements of the new approach is decentralized citizen participation, again, based on local needs. And from our perspective at Mason, one of the core points is this listening, learning, and lasting, which is really the premise of our Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities. You start by listening to what the local stakeholders need, want. As you teach, hopefully we learn from them as well. But the lasting is when the grant money ends or the students graduate, have you developed the capacity on the ground for the community to continue to developing on its own? The second point is nothing about us without us. Every solution needs to be co-developed. You can't just go in there with an outside solution, say, here's the best way to do it. You have to sit down and listen and co-develop the answers. Technology needs to be people-centered. We had a very interesting talk yesterday from Craig Fugate, former director of FEMA, and he was talking about the evolution of FEMA's thinking away from just providing funding to looking at the impact on people, and which may require differential levels of funding compared with the way things were done in the past. There have to be coordination at several levels, local, regional, national. The partnership must be public and private, have to be able to pilot, but also scale those pilots so that they can move beyond the individual places. But again, the main point is how do you co-create and develop sustainable local capacity? The goal is that Puerto Rico could begin a legacy that could ripple out throughout the Caribbean, the Americas, and Africa, potentially a role in global leadership in the digital transformation of the economy, similar to the role that Singapore has played, admittedly under much different circumstances, in Asia. So with that as background, let me turn it over to our distinguished panel. Dr. José Morey will be the moderator, and let me turn it over to Dr. Morey.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Greatly appreciate to George Mason for making Puerto Rico and making this a discussion. We've been honored to not just be here and speak with you today, but we've been honored to bring together a group of leaders from the island. I think it's very important if we're going to be talking about resilience about a people that we actually hear from leaders in that community, what they've experienced, how they overcame those obstacles, and what are the challenges that we still face as an island, as a people, from various industries. We've been able to gather together leaders from business, from nonprofits, from education, from the for-profit space to be able to come to here today to be able to speak to you. Luckily, we have Cameron McKenzie from McKenzie Associates, as well as from the Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce. Gloria Vizcasillas, who she is not here right now, but she will be joining us later. Hopefully, she's in another panel at another conference, so she will be logging in later today. From Echar Palante, CJ Acosta from Vimenti Boys and Girls Club, and from Project Makers, Dr. Ricardo Dreyfous from Dreyfous Associates, and from Dreyfus Education, and Gilberto Guevara from the Puerto Rican Research, Technology, and Science Trust. I'll be introducing these panelists one at a time, and they'll be discussing from their perspective the challenges that Puerto Rico has faced over the last several years, the obstacles that they saw from their particular industries, how they overcame some of those challenges from their industries, from their own organizations, and what is yet to come. And potentially from those who are in the audience, how do we develop these public-private partnerships that Lynn was speaking about for us to really move together and for us to be able to take advantage of the network that we have from the United States, from the diaspora, and others to overcome these challenges together. So without further ado, I will first pass it over to our first speaker, Cameron McKenzie. Cameron is an investment banker, investor, and entrepreneur. He founded the firm McKenzie & Associates after working for former U.S. Ambassador Hans H. Hurdle's consulting firm. Cameron has extensive experience in acquisition and mergers, capital raising, company valuations, and corporate financial advice, having represented public and private companies in various industries throughout the Americas. Cameron holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in business administration from Babson College. He has been recognized as a 40 under 40 by the National Association of Certified Valuators and Analysis, and awarded as an American Rising Dealmaker by the Global M&A Network. Cameron, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me here, and don't get confused, Cameron McKenzie, a Puerto Rican. So I'm very proud to be Puerto Rican. And look, I've been privileged enough to be the president and chair of the Chamber of Commerce in Puerto Rico. Albeit I was not the president and chair when we suffered historically the most ravishing hurricane that's happened through Puerto Rico, and I would even argue through one of the biggest natural disasters that happened in the United States. The Chamber of Commerce has a very important role when we talk about businesses on the island. Being the longest serving Chamber of Commerce in Puerto Rico, we roughly, through our trade associations that are tied to the Chamber of Commerce, represent closely to 70 to 80% of the GDP of the island. So we receive a lot of information from all the different sectors of what's actually happening. And these last 7 years have been nothing but tumultuous times in Puerto Rico. They've really opened a can of worms that has identified some of the main issues, structural and political, that Puerto Rico is facing to be able to get to that prosperity, or that Puerto Rico prosperity that we're trying to aim at. And it's quite extensive if you think about actually everything that's happened. And I'll go through some of the sectors so we kind of understand. And just to give you my perspective, besides being a banker, I own 5 businesses in Puerto Rico. So I have that perspective of also being a small business owner. So when you look at the island after Hurricane Maria and the total devastation that happened, equivalent to something that you see in Katrina, the logistical aspect became a significant problem. When you tie to that logistical aspects, the Jones Act, which limits the amount of how do you call this, vessels that can actually import and export from Puerto Rico, that just aggravates the issue. And being able to get all the supplies that were needed, electricity, proper healthcare, having food, and having all sorts of other essential things became a significant problem. Now we're talking in 2023, and you look at 2017, what's actually happened since there, you have earthquakes that happened, you had a COVID, you had a second hurricane. So, and you've had a significant amount of disturbance, but the problems remain relatively the same. So you have a weak electric system in the island, which affects everything else, highly dependent on imported goods. You have a healthcare system which is actually receiving significantly less than the United States, so it's roughly 50% less of Medicaid and Medicare dollars that are getting the states is what we receive in Puerto Rico. We have infrastructure that hasn't been really put up to date as it should be. So think about ports, roads, telecom. So you have a significant amount of problems that are happening at the same time. Now, how does that translate to Puerto Rican businesses? Well, you've thrown our whole logistics into the world, and what's happening is thrown the whole logistics aspect into a loop. So we have now had to become one way or the other more resilient. There's very few businesses in Puerto Rico don't have the best private healthcare insurance that they could get. Very few businesses in Puerto Rico will actually have a generator, will have solar panels, or we're looking to diversify away from the current electrical grid that's there. A lot of them are now thinking or considering being able to leave the island, right? Even though that right now Puerto Rico is probably one of the most interesting places in the world to look at because of all the federal funds that are coming. So when you add all of that, and then the main obstacles that we've seen, which really have to do with government bureaucracy and not being able to, even though we have the funds, actually put them into play to be able to have that growth spurt that Puerto Rico's been asking for, or is looking for the next 10 years. And that has been some of the main issues. So when we look at what Puerto Rico's problems are today, it's infrastructure, healthcare, you have the electric grid, and a political system that's quite complicated to be able to navigate for it to be for you to actually to be able to execute. So I think those are some of the main issues that we've seen. How the chamber has helped. We're trying to bring light to all those problems, bring our message to Washington, D.C. I've been traveling substantial amount to talk to senators, congressmen, to the federal government. And our ask really from everyone who was here in the audience and the team members is to be vocal about Puerto Rico. We do get the short end of the stick a lot. And this opportunity we have now, which is a significant amount of federal funds that are coming in, if it's well spent, would put us on an equal playing field for us to be able to compete internationally. So that would be our ask. That's what the chamber does, and that's what we've seen over the past 5 to 7 years. That has been the main hindrances of our growth. And hopefully, if we can do half of what Dr. Wells said, I'd be very happy with the outcome.
Thank you very much, Cameron. Greatly appreciate it. We'll be going back and forth at the end amongst all the panelists, having discussions and doing a little bit of deeper dives on some of the topics that they raised. But next, I'd like to switch gears a little to CJ Acosta. CJ is the managing director at Project Makers. Project Makers, big umbrella organization coming from both the educational perspective, the social impact perspective, and non-profit perspective as well. CJ has been working with Boys and Girls Clubs. He comes from a nonprofit view on things. CJ, would love to get your perspective on the challenges that you have seen over the last couple of years, how your organizations have overcome those challenges, and what do you see still being the obstacles of us moving forward?
Thank you for that intro. And I've one thing that I wanted to add to that description of what I do or what I come from is that I call myself sometimes a founder in rehab, in the sense that I was in the startup side of things for a while. I did that type of fundraising and the whole race and entrepreneurial journey that is. But when I came back to Puerto Rico, it was just 8 months before Hurricane Maria hit, and me and my wife also went through another very strong emotional experience. Then the hurricane hit, and I found myself as a marketer, technologist on an island with no energy and no communications, like a fish out of water, right? And I asked myself that question about what can I do with my skill set? And that's how I end up in the nonprofit world. I started doing work for different nonprofits, among them that were naturally started to evolve in towards entrepreneurship and fostering entrepreneurship, specifically in the town of Maya West, where I was able to get the interest of Orlando Bravo to go and establish his program there, which I helped him design too initially. And then the Boys and Girls Clubs, with the whole wave of funding that came with the CDBG funds, developed this entrepreneurship initiative focused on the communities that they also serve. And that's when they call me to lead that initiative. And that's what I'm doing right now. That's the Project Makers brand, which is currently just one big proposal operating under Boys and Girls Clubs, but it's certainly moving towards being its own self-sustaining nonprofit entity. It's looking a lot like it might be some kind of financial services entity focused on the audiences that we serve. And that's going to be very important to contextualize also the stories that I'm about to share. The audiences we serve, we serve two main audiences through Project Makers. About 80% of them are small businesses that come straight from the communities that we serve. This is people who are maybe living in the projects where also our clubs are located, and have an idea that they want to formalize, maybe a hair cutting business or some other really small business, which, by the way, it's most businesses in Puerto Rico. Most businesses, small businesses in Puerto Rico, have less than 5 employees. So those are really the engine of what we do and what we focus on. And with for those small entrepreneurs that are trying to formalize and trying to get their ideas started, we have that startup phase program, which is most of what we do, is most of the program. And then we have social impact accelerator, where we have companies that have a large global view and a scalable product that they want to implement, and that has an object of impact. It has an impact on a vulnerable community or on a vulnerable audience that we want to help, and aligns with the SDGs. And so one of the main problems, challenges that I think we have faced, apart from the typical, bureaucracy of, hey, we do have these well-funded programs, but it's being really hard to spend the money, because there is a very weird dynamic going on with the grant operators and the Department of Vivienda. So it's not as easily as that money is allocated, it will be spent on the right things. It's a matter of actually getting to spend it on the right things and having that relationship work. But apart from that, which is a more, I would say, tactical thing, the main challenge that I focus on for that big audience, what is most of my audience, is the access to capital. Because capital isn't hard to access over a certain threshold when you have a certain type of business or a certain type of network. But in the case of the audience that I serve, this is not a connected audience. This is the people. This is people whose only access to capital sometimes looks like one of those shark lenders that will give you a 400% rate, right? So that's kind of the thing that I'm competing against, if you have any sense of what the landscape looks like for them. And the idea here for me moving forward, and because the challenge is the access to capital to that audience, this might be an audience that doesn't have the credit. This is an audience that may be unbankable by the regular bank institutions or financial institutions. there are products that have been launched, and I've been studying a lot, especially specifically in communities to fix these issues. For example, cards that will report your rent to the credit bureaus to help you fix your income, and that will allow you to access a small loan later that can help you build a story to, you know, work your way up of that game. And what I'm thinking is that with the programs that we're offering through the federal funding that we're receiving, we can combine that. We have an audience of about 100 businesses right there right now, Cardiff to us. We could work the financial services side and not only bring education, but also bring with the education some capital to actually deploy and do your project, do your entrepreneurial journey, right? Because that's part of what it's not only teaching them a better thing, it's actually giving them the tool that they need to be able to do something in this system. At the end of the day, that is the system that we're living in. You need some kind of capital to be able to impact and to execute on what you're doing. So that's kind of what we're moving towards, is beyond that simple education and keep chasing grants thing. Is how do you develop a business model that, because it's nonprofit, can offer affordable, better products, better terms for your audience, and that at the same time help sustain your mission and your impact. And that's kind of a new way of looking at my space of nonprofits in Puerto Rico. And I think it's something that in the States we're a little bit more ahead, and I'm very happy to have had that experience to live there and experience nonprofits from that side through my Foster America fellowship. And that's kind of the vibe that we are trying to create along with this project. So thanks for having the chance to tell you about that and tell you about the challenge. So I appreciate any input on the access to capital side of things.
I think that'll be a discussion that we have. I think that's a very important discussion with all the potential funding that is coming to the island, of how do we ensure who is controlling that capital and how that capital is being managed. And how do we put the checks and balances onto that capital to ensure that it's being utilized for the people, by the people kind of perspective. So thank you, CJ. Muchas gracias por eso. We will move over now to hear from Dr. Ricardo Dreyfous. Dr. Dreyfous is founder of Dreyfous & Associates and the Dreyfous Educational Platform. They have many different offerings under their educational platform. They're one of the leaders in education, both in Puerto Rico as well as in several countries throughout Latin America. Dr. Dreyfous began his journey in education. He started in 1993, founding the company. And the main focus of the company is to move educational forward, both through digital innovation and through digital technologies. They have a very strong foundation in being a Puerto Rican entity, and they truly believe that it is with passion that you make a difference. And I can honestly say that I've seen Dr. Dreyfous move forward in passion in various aspects. So Dr. Dreyfous, thank you very much for being here today. And please, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks for having me. And one of the things that definitely we like to see is that education is so important to any society that we have to find ways of keep education moving, even when we don't have the resources and the things to do it. For example, when we started, let's move on to the other slide, please. And to understand what we have done is first see what we as a company have done. First, we started with manipulatives, but at that time we were moving to technology. Then we found that the only way to improve is that make sure that everything we do is to improve the students, the possibility of getting the best education possible. And in this case, we want, even if the students live in any rural areas, everywhere and anywhere, we want the students to learn. That's why we created EduSystem. And in Puerto Rico, first we had Hurricane Maria. Hurricane Maria, what it did is first destroy the whole electrical system, and most of the schools were with no electricity from the company for months in some cases. But a lot of them had small generator, electrical generator. In that sense, then they say, okay, what can we do with education? We already had a server with all our content there. And the content, what we used to do is just go to the school, connect our server to the generator, and then allow the teachers to plan for 2 months, because we didn't have enough servers to provide for each one of the schools. What we did is, okay, we borrow for 2 or 3 days, then ask the teachers to plan for 2 months, and the students will be able to download their lessons for those 2 months. Then we move on to another school. In those cases where the schools didn't have any kind of generator, then we asked the teachers to come to our facilities and do the same thing, plan for 2 months. And with the directors, school directors, what we used to do is just bring the students to our facilities. And since we had electricity, and because we had 2 generators all the time running, and we have our service, and we also had the technology for them to download. One of the things that we learned that the students always had their devices charged. They use their parents' cards, they use everything to charge their devices. And let's move to another slide, yeah. And the next one, please. The schools, all of them, what we did was, okay, we make sure that they already had what they need for 2 months. And those 2 months, for most of them, they need it. And for the institutions, since also we are ISP, Internet Service Providers, for more than 200 private and public libraries, private schools and public libraries. Then we, in the metro area, we already have a wireless network. Most of them that were not connected, we connected to that wireless network to make sure that when, since their fiber optic lines were definitely not working because they were cut, then when they could use it, once the fiber optic lines were fixed, then they go back to the fiber optics lines. What we did with this, it helped us to prepare for the next step. Following slide, please. Slides. After Maria, what we did is, okay, we prepare for something like this to happen again, but we didn't know it will happen so soon. Then the earthquakes in the south part of the island came. Next one, please. And the earthquakes were, we thought it was only affecting the schools in the south area of Puerto Rico. We've later found out that the whole island was affected because most of the schools had not very good structure. That means they were damaged. In that case, then we thought, well, let's do the following. Since a lot of schools and parents from the south of Puerto Rico, they call us to buy our system, say, no, wait, this is a crisis. What we have done, what we do is just open our platform for free for everybody in the south. Then we found out, since that the whole island was in the same situation, then we opened it for the whole island. And we create an initiative, the initiative Dreyfous Te Da La Mano, which means Dreyfus lends you a hand. And we created, since the LMS was, in some cases, needed some time to learn how to use it. Then we created an app, it's called EduPR, where the students and the teachers and parents will be able to use our content for learning from pre-K to 12th grade in all the core subjects. Along with us, the United Ways organization helped us to get into most of the communities and to prepare for that. That was in January 2020. Then what happened? In March 2020, we got pandemic. Next slides, please. Then, since we already have EduPR created, what we have done is then open to everybody in Puerto Rico, private and public schools. And since the Department of Education already approved to use our content for other schools, what we have to do is just then prepare a lot of our employees to help the students as well as the teachers and parents then how to use it. After that, next one, please. Then what happened? Then we have the pandemic. The pandemic will extend, as I mentioned before, the extend Dreyfous Te Da La Mano for all the private and public schools in Puerto Rico. And more than 225,000 students, teachers, and parents used it for a long time. We also implemented to other countries like Dominican Republic, Panama, and Colombia. The good thing is that we learned that Puerto Rico has to be prepared. Has to be prepared because our system in terms of electricity and in terms of telecommunication is not very well, it's not robust. It's not something that we could rely on. And it means that we have to be ready for something like this to happen because we are in the pathway of the hurricanes. That means we've learned that definitely that we could use our experience with these servers, with the help to the schools, with other countries that they don't have the infrastructure that they need to improve education. Next one, please. It's just, we learned that the kids always have the devices charged. We learned that the people need printed material. We learned that we have to be ready with the technology and the equipment to overcome the problems that we could have, and definitely we will have. And Puerto Rico definitely could be an example to other countries that could right now going through the same thing we went through after Maria and during the pandemic. Any question? I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dreyfus. Greatly appreciated, sir. We'll definitely be coming back to questions about how we can scale education, and also to all the panelists, we'll probably discuss what have we lost? What have we lost from an educational perspective? What are the ramifications on that on our potential business growth, and to perpetuate the ecosystem that we have on the island internally, and making sure that we have the capacity to have the proper skills, not just currently, but into the future with future generation, with that gap in education that could have potentially affected many generations. But first, we'll go over to now Gilberto Guevara, who's a senior manager at a Puerto Rican Science, Technology, and Research Trust. Gilberto is an entrepreneur, international business doctorate candidate. He received his MBA in International Commerce and Finance and Bachelor's in Finance from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. His entire career, he's managed and led multidisciplinary and multinational emergency response teams of expats in the Americas and Asia. He has had over 35 years of work in the humanitarian world as part of the American Red Cross and the International Federation of Red Cross and the Red Crescent, the IFRC. And recently with FEMA and the recovery from Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. He's been a national instructor in disaster and college director for a national humanitarian work instructor. He instituted the Cooperating Collection Center from the Foundation Center and an investment laboratory for finance majors at the University of Puerto Rico. He currently has been leading efforts to create energy resiliency through innovations and technologies and alternative energy sources to replace fossil fuels. Gilberto, thank you very much for being there physically and at the venue. The floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, welcome to all of the guests here, and I'm glad to be here. From my perspective, is talking about the walking the talk from the Caribbean Center for Rising Seas, which is one of the 20 programs that the Puerto Rico Science Trust. We have begun to work diligently on the resilience past Maria and looking at the lessons that have been learned since Maria's response, now the recovery, to facilitate and maintain that capacity. At the Puerto Rico Science Trust, with over 200 employees, being a nonprofit, We aim to always pull in the resources from the community, as you'll see, from the Caribbean Center, just a spec or a sampling of the different providers and partners that we have on the left hand, right hand side. And our mission is to prepare not only Puerto Rico, but the rest of the Caribbean to adapt and to thrive. We've been resilient all along. We've known disasters. We've known with now the Fiscal Oversight Management Board, all of the problems that the economy has caused in Puerto Rico. And we are aiming to facilitate, to build the capacity through investment at the Puerto Rico Science Trust. That's what we want to do. And we have begun through the Caribbean Center to build the resiliency and the adaptation with a 100-year perspective. And that's important. As you all know, most of the builders and the trained builders, the architects, the engineers would like to have all of their legacy work last 100 years, and that's what they're trained for. As we look at and we move to the reality, and that's one of the findings from some of the research papers that we've had, we see that mortgages are tied to a 30-year span. We also see that insurance is tied on an annual basis. We see that federal agencies like the U.S. Corps of Engineers are tied to a 30-year planning perspective. We're not looking at the 100-year perspective, which is what this new challenge of climate change evokes for us. In the center, and the Puerto Rico Science Trust chose and elected one of the effects of climate change. That's why the center was brought up. And it's the biggest threat that we have in a Caribbean environment or an island environment, and that's the sea level rise. That's why we're looking at, what are our goals within the next 50 to 100 years? How are environments going to look like? So we're always doing the environmental scanning. We will know, and I'll show some pictures later on of what's already happening with the ongoing sea tides of flooding, actually becoming resident sea tides for very wealthy communities in the metropolitan area in Puerto Rico. So we're having to move from the activating the response and the recovery modes into more of the adaptation. What is it that we need to do in the next 100 years? And that obviously drives us to, from the research perspective, questioning and reframing the policies that are in place. And not only the policies, but also the regulations that are put in place. And I'll address that in a minute. Just a historical perspective, that's what Puerto Rico looked like 20,000 years ago. So you could walk from Puerto Rico all the way to Virgin Gorda, and that's one of the most beautiful sites for, underwater sightseeing right now. This is the problem now. The sea continues to rise. And as we know from the climate change, the problem is getting worse. For us, we've reached the tipping point. We may even, by some arguments, pass that tipping point. I'll show some slides in terms of the CO2 and what that is doing to warming the seas. That calls us to develop a greater understanding on coastal communities and what coastal communities have to do, particularly the businesses in jeopardy. We've already begun to talk about the elements of the economy and a solid economy are businesses. This is well known to all of you. Sea level is tracked with temperature historically, and the CO2. What concerns us is that spike, that continual rise on that CO2. Now we're beyond the 1.5 degree warming of the seas. How much warmer we will get, we don't know. And that's what already is causing this influx of problems and difficulties for a lot of the coastal, a lot of island communities. What we aim to do, and our goals at the center, and we've begun very thoroughly to redefine the professional knowledge. How are our architects and engineers being trained right now in terms of the climate change and in terms of sea level rise? We need to understand, we need to have these professions understand sea level rise. Our next effort will be to touch base and to tap all the financial institutions. And of course, part of that is driving the building professionals to demand for better building codes because it's their licenses, it's their reputation that's online if they're building structures in a very risky areas. We also need to ensure that the federal funds that are being spent don't get respent every time. That's one of the reasons, and we applaud this change or this transition from the mitigation programs to the building resilient infrastructure and communities, a new BRIC program. We'll see if there's an impact on actual zoning changes. We aim to stand up, and we have already begun the process of putting together an observatory, a research-based research observatory on land use and regulations in Puerto Rico that can be shared. Those lessons can be shared with other islands in the Caribbean. The final aim, and you see the top of the pyramid that I took apart, is to change the urban development practices. And we heard some of the speakers yesterday that that's the biggest challenge that we're facing now. There's no affordable housing for a lot of folks. And we've got to begin to look at how we are going about this urban development practices. For us, it's been a challenge. The policy doesn't get changed very frequently. There is some effort now, especially with all of this barrage of funds that are coming in, and the public is beginning to demand that the new infrastructure projects are built outside of the coastal zones, and that they do that as soon as possible, where it's feasible. And for those who are already in coastal areas, is beginning that process of an orderly relocation outside of those coastal areas. One of the biggest challenges that we'll face, and we're beginning to look at the resources to put together the research capacities within the University of Puerto Rico, are the climate refugees. In Puerto Rico alone, there are over 200,000 families, and a family, with 3 or 4 individuals are at risk of becoming refugees and having to be relocated from their coastal areas. That's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is right now, 9 of the generating plants in Puerto Rico for electricity that were damaged as a result of Maria's effects are all located in coastal areas, and the resilience is not built into the recovery efforts that are going on. So, and I mentioned yesterday that FEMA was taken to court because they're paying for the building in the same areas. The concept of build back better is just not taking place in Puerto Rico, and that's something that we need to ensure it happens. Those generating facilities, power generating facilities, must be built inland, must be built elsewhere, not where they're going to be flooded and they're going to be destroyed in the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years. Outside of the power generation, also you take a look at the GDP. One of the greatest GDP providers in the island environment is tourism. The tourism industry is going to be greatly affected from all of these sea level rise. And what are we doing now to protect that industry, or at least to project new ways in which that industry can be income generating for the country? That's a question that we have posed. And of course, many of you know, and those who have been to Puerto Rico, it's a pretty historic area. A lot of those historic and a lot of those cultural assets are going to be underwater. They're going to be affected by sea level rise, and that's a big challenge for us. So that's what we aim to do with the observatory, as we pull together and collect all of this body of information. And I have to tell you, we're very happy that there are over 120 scientists in Puerto Rico alone dedicated to the research of climate change issues. I can say that that's more than any of the other islands put together in the Caribbean. We aim to share all of this information, anticipating that the health challenges are going to be great. We also need to develop a new skill set on a workforce, Right now we're faced, just like in the States, with this lack of workforce to do a lot of the reconstruction and the rebuild. Imagine now tagging on this other problem of having to build elsewhere or having to concern with the impacts of sea level rise. And of course, looking at the innovations that must be made in public policy and the regulations. More support tools and more research need to be developed in this whole area. And that's what we're promoting through the investment. As you look at Puerto Rico, you'll see that, 90% of Puerto Rico is going to be, 10 feet above sea level. So we have high elevation, and that's good for us. I just gave you the facts. Those little areas that you see shaded in red or pink are where the 200,000 plus families live that will have to be relocated. For us, it's a sad story, but it's one that we can forecast that is going to happen, and we can begin to take action now so that other countries in the Caribbean and islands elsewhere that are not as fortunate or are less fortunate by not having the elevation will be greater affected, and we can share that knowledge with them. So, what are the lessons? There are short, mid, and long-term lessons. Right now, the increasing water shortages and the drainage capacity is a big headache. Many of the water reservoirs are becoming contaminated with salt water. There are bans on new construction in 3 of the municipalities in the southern part of Puerto Rico, just because there isn't any water to supply them with. So that's something that we need to look at. The redesigning of the flat plains, the designing the floodable areas, and the vertical room for the water, that's of immediate need and of great concern right now. For the midterm, we're looking at the increasing the redundancy, obviously for more resilience, and those include increasing the margins of safety. So I said, the coastal areas is problem, lifting and enabling the building resilience and adaptation. And then on the long term is recognizing the growing obsolescence of some of the available tools. We chatted yesterday about firms. Glad to hear that FEMA is looking at firms. We see it as a forensic tool that doesn't include any of the new projections for sea level rise. That needs to change. Zoning regulations need to change. And at the end, we'll end up moving to higher ground. Education and advocacy is one of the roles that we do constantly. This is one of the pictures I told you I would show you. That's permanent flooding area now that's happening in Condado. So you get to one of these expensive hotels near the lagoon area. You have to, they don't tell you, but you have to wade through water right now to get into them. And some of the nicer beaches that are in the area, the touristy areas, now are becoming flooded on a regular basis, not just from king tides, but just the simple sea level rise. Solutions, and what we've already begun to apply. Research observatory that's going to work long-term on the adaptation issues. The policy reference and resource center, believe that needs to happen. And while we are outdated in the policies that we have in Puerto Rico, because we're still taking a look at what the Spaniards left in terms of what the coastal areas are, we also need to influence the policy here in Washington, D.C. as they look at the island. We've talked enough that there hasn't been a focus or there hasn't been enough resourcing from the executive agencies looking at some of the issues that they need to deal with in the Puerto Rico area. An advisory service program, that's what we already stood up, and we're working with many nonprofits as well as other community organizations and universities, and we're doing a lot of outreach. So the question is, why act now? As the founder of the Sea Level Rise Institute in Florida area, and one of our advisors says, sea level rise has passed beyond the tipping point. We must rise with the tide. What that means is we've got to move inland. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilberto. Muchas gracias. Thank you to all the panelists that have spoken so far. From an IT technical perspective for the team, Jenny and Aaron, can you please reach out to Gloria again? I think the last request from her was to resend the link, or perhaps check.
Yeah, we've reset the link.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So for our last panelists, it doesn't seem that they've been able to log on. That's fine. So we'll switch over to just having a discussion unless they log back in. So we've talked a lot about the different perspectives, different areas of expertise, and the challenges that all of you have faced. Now the opportunities that we have as a people and as an island is these new fundings and these new kind of initiatives that from a federal and local agencies have been paying attention to the island. In your opinions, in your professional expertise, how should the funding priorities be? Lynn talked about how that's potentially over $100 billion between federal monies and New York Fed monies and others. What should be some of the major priorities of these fundings, A? And then B, how do you see who should be controlling these funds? How should these funds be distributed? Should it be centralized in the government? Should it be dispersed amongst different NGOs or nonprofits? Or should a different type of agency be coordinating these funds? Because it seems that might be one of the difficult challenges of who should be administering these funds, what should be the priorities. And then lastly, a question I would ask the panel is how, in your opinions, how should the funds be tracked to ensure that it really is the people of Puerto Rico that are getting the advantages of these funds and not some potentially multinational that kind of uses the funds and then the funds are gone afterwards. Cameron, I'll start with you, sir. And your perspective, what are some of the major things that we should be looking to use the funds for? Who should be potentially controlling those funds? And what priorities should they be used for?
I'll try not to get myself in too much trouble with what I'm gonna say. Yeah, and I'm actually gonna take this just a little bit different. I'll say, if that's all right with you. I think the number one priority, and something that's not discussed enough, is education in Puerto Rico. I think our public school system in Puerto Rico is significantly below the average in the United States. And we all know the complexities of having an island economy. So our best opportunity to be able to not think what's going to happen 5-10 years, but if you're thinking 20-25 years down the road, is really investing significantly in education. I think a lot of the how they say in Spanish, mango bajito, or the easy opportunities here are those that the federal funds can easily tackle. You know, infrastructure, electricity, and other areas where you can see effect quickly. But the real discussion, the real game changer here to 20 years is education. Well, I think, and when you ask me who should be administering the funds, you see, that's a very difficult question to answer. Because if you put too much bureaucracy, then the funds aren't dispersed. If you put too little bureaucracy, then the funds are misused. So how do we actually identify what's the best way to utilize those funds? It's still a conundrum. I think that's one of the issues and one of the main reasons why you haven't seen those many funds actually been spent. And you're going to see a significant effort now, because the political aspects also are going to take a toll now. We're coming into the election season in Puerto Rico and in the United States. They're going to want to see results, and we need to see how that's going to impact it. So how those funds are spent and how do we track that? You know, we need expert supervision. I think that should definitely be in private hands more than public hands. Just the idea of aligning incentives, right? You know, you don't want people who are running for office, in my humble opinion, I might be mistaken here, overseeing things that might help them get into office, right? So I think in that perspective, really having private oversight would be great. If it's a non-for-profit or a private entity, I think skill set matters more than actual the corporate entity. Would we want it to be in Puerto Rican companies' hands? Of course. Now, there are limitations to how Puerto Ricans can actually be part of it because of, particularly the construction industry, because of bonding capacity, track record, and whatnot. So for that, you need to flexibilize the federal funding procedures, which is very difficult as well. So we have, I guess, unfortunately, what I'm trying to say is that your question is one which is very difficult to answer, and that there's no clarity on how that's going to be executed. So that is my best answer. Unfortunately, I'm a very straight talker. So I see things how I talk. I say things how I see them. They're not necessarily right, but that is my perception on it. And I do think that, and it's not talked enough. And I'll just end my remarks with that. In an island economy tied with the Jones Act and difficulty of exporting products from Puerto Rico because of the obvious, the high electricity cost, the healthcare problems that we have, the thing that we need to be focusing on to fix Puerto Rico 20 years down the road is education. And it's really investing significantly in that, and that will help us as I forget, Gilberto said that the rise, we need to rise with the tide, I guess, or rise to the occasion. I think it really is education front and center.
No, I know it's a difficult conversation, but that's what we're here to have and to have discussion. And I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. So I wouldn't put yourself down for that perspective. I think we need to be earnest and honest with each other and have these types of conversations to get to the core of the problem, or as close as we can, and then hopefully come to some sort of solution that's as close to the best we can. We're at the end of the day, we're all humans, and we all err, and we're all trying to do what's best and come together from a different perspectives. Before Gloria, thank you so much for making the call. Before we switch over to Gloria, any of the other panelists want to piggyback on what Cameron said? CJ.
I just wanted to mention quickly that there are some private solutions being offered for what Cameron is saying, especially education. Like project makers and Boys and Girls Clubs are both under the umbrella of the Platform for Social Impact, which has a branch of it, you could say, that is focused on education called Vimenti. Vimenti is the first charter school of the public education system of Puerto Rico, and they are anchored in one of the poorest zip codes in San Juan, right in the Ernesto Ramos Antonini's residential project, right behind the Mall of San Juan. And Vimenti is becoming an experiment of sorts for this whole education initiative, because they serve two generations. They serve the parents and the kids through education, the parents by helping them get a job or develop their businesses by referring them to project makers. So that's kind of what we're aiming to do, creating an ecosystem of support that can spend the money and make sure that it's already working on behalf of the people that it should be working for. Right. So that's an example of a private nonprofit solution that's being offered to that.
Jose, I'd like to add, most of the recovery funds have a sunset date. And we began to see that millions of dollars are being lost just because of the lack of proficiency in the application process. Some of that was discussed yesterday. That's a concern. My point of view and the recommendations that we've begun to push forward is to let the third sector involved. Take the case of Puerto Rico, since that's what this discussion is about. There are 4 big corporations now, nonprofit entities that could aid the government, could be assistant to the government when federal government transfers funds to territorial governments or to state governments. That's where it stays. That needs to go in further down and allow for the nonprofit world to come in and step up to the plate and help. So I'm glad to see that CJ is pushing that envelope, but more of that needs to happen.
One of the things I would like to add to this, if I may, is that definitely in Puerto Rico, sometimes the government assumes all the roles that sometimes they don't have the most prepared people, and we need to add other people to those decision making. For example, private sector, the universities, and all those people that can contribute to improve education and not just stay close to and then decide what they're doing, because the whole thing is affecting everybody. That means we have to involve everybody to, in a sense, that bring people that they are expert on those things and ask them how to move on, because sometimes the Department of Education takes a long time to decide because they don't have the people and they don't have the time. Then why you don't get involved the universities and they could do it, and the private sectors, and the education in general, and the nonprofit organization also.
All excellent points, and thank you all for your commentary. I want to give the opportunity and the floor to Gloria Vizcasillas. Thank you so much, Gloria, for being here. A little bit on Gloria before she begins. She is lead integrator at Echar Palante Multi-Sector Alliance. She's a seasoned business intelligence professional, knowledge manager, strategic planner, and change leader. She's charged with regional international initiatives, integration of global consumer understanding, and institutionalization of innovation at leading multinational companies. Entrepreneurial ecosystem builder at the collective engineered Echar Palante Multi-Sector Alliance. She's passionate about education and youth development with an emphasis in empowering globally competitive citizens through critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, lifelong learning, self-reflection, and self-direction. Gloria, the floor is yours.
Buenos
Thank
dias, my
you.
friend.
Thank you
I'm
very
going to run
much.
your presentation for you from here, so just let me know when you need to change slides.
Thank you, Aaron.
Perfect. Can you hear me? Yes, perfect. Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. This is my second time in Star Tides. I had the privilege of being there last year in the cold weather. I see that you're all cozy in there. Hello, Linton. Big love from Puerto Rico. It is my pleasure today to share with you a project that is very dear to the heart of many in this conference right now. For the past 11 years now, we are turning 11 this week, we have been integrating an effort to accelerate entrepreneurship and innovation in Puerto Rico. However, before I start sharing the presentation, I would like to make some philosophical comments and address something that you already said. When we started, we basically realized that we needed to reskill our whole population. And if we recall what the Chinese philosopher said about a millennium ago, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. But if you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Next. The Chinese philosophers also said that if you teach a man to teach another man how to fish, then you can feed the world. And next, we are true believers that we need to teach our kids to fish. And you have been addressing some of the things that we're doing in Puerto Rico to help train our kids properly. But what does that mean? If we look into the projections about the future of work, the World Economic Forum has been saying that by 2025, 52% of the tasks that are currently handled by humans will be managed through artificial intelligence. And that by 2027, 50% of the global workforce will depend on entrepreneurship. Next. What that means is that we need Puerto Ricans to get ready now. We need to get all our population through a skilling, reskilling, and upskilling process so that we develop the skills that are essential for the future of work and life. I don't think we're talking anymore about the future. The pandemic accelerated the process of change, and we are talking about the now more than the future. Next. About 13 years ago, we conducted a series of studies to understand what was the situation of entrepreneurship in Puerto Rico. And believing that entrepreneurship is a key lever for economic development. At the moment, using the model of Dr. Daniel Eisenberg, then in Harvard, now in Babson College, we realized that our so-called entrepreneurship ecosystem was really non-existent. We had a few efforts that were very small with very little impact, great people putting all their passion to do the best they could. Most of the folks that were involved in any entrepreneurship support efforts were handling 2-3 different projects. So it's even misleading this visual because it was the same people in each of those boxes and with very, very little impact. Next. Today, we can say that we have been able to develop our ecosystem. We have been doing it purposefully. We have been doing it with a lot of force. We have been doing it as much as possible strategically and systemically. And all the boxes that are that needed to be filled, all the essential components according to Dr. Eisenberg's model, have been filled. But this chart is also misleading because most of the efforts here are from the past 5-6 years, and they coincide with hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemics, changes in government, etc., etc., etc. So basically, all these organizations are still in a learning curve. And even though they are strengthening and starting to have an impact, the impact is still very small. However, we have been able to identify 4 main needs that have been consistently identified as the same ones for the past 5 to 6 years. And they were the need for education, and that's the one we want to stress today. The second, they need to develop a mentors corps of trained mentors corps, again, education at the core of the effort. We needed to purposefully stimulate the development of a startup pipeline, and there is a lot of money available, but people don't know where it is and they don't know how to get it, and they need accompaniment to be able to complete the requests and the process to benefit from the funding that is available. Next. I think this may not be the final presentation, but I will use this one, okay? We actually have been studying the situation in a very systematic fashion. And since 2013, we have been conducting the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Originally, it gave us benchmark insights, and we were among the last places in the world in terms of the development of entrepreneurship compared to all the places and all the countries that were measured. As you can see, we have been steadily improving, and we are very, very happy with our results today. Just a week ago, we were able to present the results for the 2022, for last year. We had to skip a year because of the pandemic. And the results are showing us that what we have been doing was right on, and our curve continues to improve for every single of the key indicators. As a matter of fact, the only indicator that is actually growing and it's not a good thing is the fear of success, is the fear of engaging in entrepreneurship. But apart from that, folks are telling us that they know more people that are engaged in entrepreneurship. The perceptions about opportunities to be successful starting a new business are going up. And the perception that the folks have the capacity, that they have what it takes and have developed the knowledge to start a business effectively is also going up. And more important, the intent to start a business in the next 3 years, that is the one that that question is the one that tends to correlate the most with results in the future, is going up. We started with only 13% of the population that said that they were planning on starting a business in 2013. And we actually know now that we're in about 27%. So basically, we have doubled the number of people that have the intention to engage in entrepreneurship. However, as I mentioned before, the World Economic Forum projects that figure will be in 50% by 2027. So we're halfway through. We need to continue our efforts because hopefully by 2027, we will be in 50% along with the total workforce that is engaged in entrepreneurship. Next, and you can go quickly. Perfect. Next. Given that this was such a huge opportunity, we started an effort to integrate everybody that had something to do with entrepreneurship in the island. And here's where I would like to make the comment building on what you had mentioned before. Yes, definitely we can leverage the third sector. And we actually can leverage the private sector too, and the academia. But what we have found is that not a single sector can carry on what we need to do to truly get out of the rut we had fallen into. Today, we need to follow what is called advanced citizenship practices, and we need to integrate all sectors. It is not enough to just at the private sector or just depend on the third sector. We actually need all the sectors to work together, and we need to develop purposefully an entrepreneurship culture and share with the whole population what we're trying to do and why, and then benefit from the support of all the sectors. Each one can have a different role, but we will only be able to move forward if we bring together all the sectors in an integrated, cohesive fashion, developing, designing, and implementing systems that will truly transform our current modus operandi. And to that end, last year, the Puerto Rico Economic Development Secretary presented Puerto Rico's long-term economic development strategic framework. And it includes 5 axes, 5 large all-encompassing work streams. And one of them is the enterprising island that the Charpalante movement has been designated to lead. And that is a key component of this long-term economic development framework. And another component was also proposed by a Charpalante, but is being led by a multi-sector effort, and the Charpalante is only participating as a stakeholder. It's the one that refers to globally competitive citizens. So we basically believe that in order to redirect Puerto Rico's economic efforts and move forward, we need to make sure that we transform our education system and develop globally competitive citizens. And by that, we mean folks that can work in Puerto Rico for Puerto Rico, that if they work from Puerto Rico for the world, they will be globally competitive, or if they move anywhere in the world, they would also be globally competitive. And this is becoming more and more important for everybody around the world, because the migration patterns that are expected to accelerate in the next few years are going to result in a lot of people moving from one place to another. So everybody needs to make sure that their educational systems develop globally competitive citizens. Next. So what is a Charpalante? Basically, a Charpalante is a multi-sector alliance that was established 11 years ago with the mission of integrating multi-sector efforts to accelerate a culture of globally competitive entrepreneurship, innovation, resilience, and sustainability to propel prosperity in Puerto Rico. Next. At the moment, we had, when we first started, we had engaged a group of social scientists that had studied our situation and had realized that we had fallen in what they call the new poverty, la nueva pobreza. Basically, we're not talking about being economically poor. We're talking about being, we call it spiritually poor, of a condition of being, feeling that there's nothing else you can do and that your circumstances are something you cannot control and you cannot overcome. And that had made our population fall in a state of inertia. And we realized we needed to start an intervention that had to come from many different places. This is too big a problem that needs to be addressed from many different perspectives. So our challenge at the moment was how to energize Puerto Rico's despairing population via collective action for progress. We studied models around the world and selected the collective impact initiative model that had been developed by the School of Social Innovation from Stanford University. And we adapted the model to Puerto Rico with the help of the folks from Stanford. We actually flew them to Puerto Rico and had Laura Herman, who was heading the collective impact initiative consultancy, help us to train a group of about 70 multi-sector leaders on how to implement the model. And the solution that we defined was, I'm proud to say, powered by Banco Popular, the institution that I have been working with for the past 20 years. And we decided to move forward this new collective impact movement. Since then, we started little by little to integrate different sectors and to first study the best practices, the leading practices around the world, then define for Puerto Rico the models we thought could work. We piloted, we refined them, we pivoted as necessary, and then once we felt our models were working, we would scale up. Exactly the same as you would do with a new business. But this is a social enterprise that we are putting together. So basically, we have been moving forward together for the past 11 years. And the result is that we have an effective multi-sector alliance that is leading the development of a very strong entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystem for socioeconomic progress in Puerto Rico. And we are aspiring to become the enterprising island. Next.
Gloria, I hate to cut you off, but the next panel has to start. So if you could just finish up on this last slide, that would be, thank you.
I will very quickly. So our three main strategies have been to build the movement, to build entrepreneurship capacity, and to build systems to transform our schools and municipalities into enterprising communities. Next. 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 Right now, we're pleased to share that we have, please leave it here. We are pleased to share that we have already reached a critical mass in all the key stakeholders we decided to address. And this is the model that we had designed to transform Puerto Rico into an enterprise island. We are first training our college professors, and we already have trained 106 college professors that are in turn trained our school directors. We 6% of our public school teachers, and we have trained 10,061 teachers. We developed a Mentors Corp and trained 496 entrepreneur support practitioners, and having the systems that are being implemented at the school, college, and community level. So basically, this is what it is, and we already implemented all the key components of the system and are scaling up right now and evolving to be able to continue growing. So this is what we have been doing, and any questions you can write me, probably you can share with them my email. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to share what we have been doing.
No, thank you, Gloria. And Cameron, unfortunately, I had to jump. He had another call at 11. I want to thank very much all our panelists for being here. Thank you to George Mason to Star Tides, and Lynn Wells. Thank you so much for the opportunity for having all of us speak. And I hope everyone sees that Puerto Rico is not just an opportunity place for you to come and work and collaborate with amazing, resilient leaders, but we are already a shining example of resiliency. And I hope you can see that with all the folks that have presented here today. Lynn, if you have any last comments before we end.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you very much for the presentations, all of you. And we'll conclude here.